Um, we have with us this afternoon Professor Jose Casanova. And as you heard me talk, he's one of great sociologists, truly great sociologists of religion today. I think that the text that you have assigned for today is just about the best thing available at all to read on sociology of religion. So it's a great pleasure for us to have Professor Casanova with us again today. This is his second time participating in Faith and Globalization course, and he was asking me to make some comparative judgments between this class and the previous one, and I told him that I told him that I love all my children equally, and each is special in their own ways. But in honor of Professor Casanova, who I had only realized that today has actually seriously, over an extended period of time, studied theology. And studied by a student of one of the really, truly great 20th century Catholic theologians, Karl Rahner. I'm going to tell you a story about Karl Rahner in honor of Professor Casanova, but I hope to your benefit. When I was a student at University of Tübingen, there was a lecture announced by the great Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, and he was to receive a major award there. He was at that time something like 85 years of age. He had influenced the course of the Catholic theology and Catholic Church, indeed, because he was active on one of the major events in Catholic Church in the 60s. Second Vatican Council, the major theologian of Second Vatican Council, kind of intellectual giant, truly, if there was one. And the lecture that was announced was plastered all over this small university town of Tübingen, and it read, "Intellektuelle Geduld in sich selbst." It was intellectual patience in itself. And so we were all, you know, kind of looking through this at the title and kind of pondering what might the great theologian say about the very essence of intellectual patience. You know, we were just all puzzled about the title and kind of didn't know what to make of it. And then he stands up when he's delivering this lecture and says, you know, there was a slight mistake in transmission of my title. The title should be Die intellektuelle Geduld mit sich selbst. Intellectual patience with oneself. Here he is, 85 years of age, one of the greatest, right? And one of the last public lectures that he gave was a public lecture on intellectual patience with oneself. Now, around this time of the course, many a student has lost intellectual patience with themselves. There's material has kind of amassed, and it's going in every which direction, and new things are coming at you from every side. I think that maybe it's a good time to remind oneself to have intellectual patience with oneself, and that pieces that seem disjointed now may fall in place in a particular way and surprising way in the course of this class. Also, I think sometimes when I talk to divinity school students, I talk also about spiritual patience with oneself, because very often when one studies religion, one's own cherished convictions about faith get to be unsettled, and suddenly the frame that you brought with you is all out of whack, and you think the whole world might be possibly out of whack. You don't know how to orient yourself in the world anymore. Again, a certain patience with oneself for the pieces to come back together, for old paradigm, to use Thomas Kuhn's language, for old paradigm maybe to give way to something new, and the time in between of sifting and changing, that can be a painful but very creative and very important time. So, now to session number 5, faiths as shapers of globalization. As you will recall, our last session was about secularization and transformation of faiths in encounter with globalization processes. The present session is primarily about the impact, possible impact of faiths on globalization processes. And that's a central session for us in many ways because we are asking how these two interact and whether there is any possibility of the resources of faith traditions being brought to bear upon globalization processes, just as we were asking of the impact of globalization processes upon faiths. And presupposition for what we are doing here is that there is this progressive globalization that is combined with vibrancy of faiths. And so the question becomes is how does one understand this single process of globalization in conjunction with multiplicity of different faiths and also of different cultures? And the question is whether there is only one way to globalize, or there may be multiple ways to globalize. And when we talked about secularization, we talked about then now in recent years a thesis that was suggested by Eisenhardt, but also Professor Casanova is one of the main proponents, as well as Charles Taylor, of multiple modernities. And you have read a piece by Charles Taylor on multiple modernities, which provides, in many ways, a kind of intellectual analysis of the processes of modernization and how and the role that cultural element plays in globalization, in modernization processes. And roughly, I think one can then analogously say to the thesis of multiple modernities that we have, in my terms, something like a globalization in multiple cultural registers. You can recognize it as a single worldwide process, and yet it looks very differently depending on where you find yourself. And those multiple cultural settings, they inflect, if you want, globalization processes in a particular way. They shape those globalization processes. And I think that element of cultural shaping of globalization processes, I think is a very significant element for this class. And we can debate to what extent Taylor's thesis stands. What do we do with that cultural element versus kind of our cultural elements of globalization? But it's important for us to name that. I think it's significant also for us to keep in mind how it is that Taylor defines culture, right? And definition of culture, I mean, there are many of many definitions of culture, but he uses the culture to describe the kind of the set of explicit and tacit convictions about the self, about society, about the good, about the nature as a whole, about the world. That's his, for the purposes of that paper, but that's his definition of culture. And you'll recall how in the last part of his essay, he talks about this kind of tacit, unspoken dimension that's not expressed necessarily in beliefs, but simply in kinds of expectations with which one operates. That's a very important element which he uses in his, you recall me talking about his doorstopper book, The Secular Age, where he's interested in the conditions under which now the question of God is a problematic one rather than simply being self-understood one, and talks about secularization in these terms. That's also what he's trying to express with this kind of range of tacit convictions as well as belief. He calls it social imaginary, right? Which makes certain things natural for us to do, natural for us to, quote unquote, natural for us to believe. Now, for our purposes here, this whole idea of self, society, nature, and the good as key elements of the culture are very important. As you will recall, I have from the very beginning, maybe controversially, but defined religions or faiths as being precisely, fundamentally in wide varieties of ways about that. They offer overarching interpretation of reality. They situate the self in an overarching interpretation of reality, and they ask the question, what does it mean to live well? What is the account of the good life? And that good account of the good life is connected with the idea of the good. So if it's the case that globalization refracts itself through this way of understanding of culture, as Taylor suggests, then obviously you can say, well, how do the accounts of the world, of the self, or social relations, of the good that are embedded, embodied in faith traditions, how do they intersect with globalization processes? And indeed, if you look then at some of the religious thinkers that we have had assigned for today, you will see that that's precisely the level at which they're engaging globalization processes. They're engaging globalization processes also at the kind of moral level, but more deeply, I think, they're engaging it at this level of interpretation of reality, of the self, and of social relations. Now, I'll, instead of commenting here about Benedict XVI and John Paul II in this particular text that you've read, I'm going to take what we did last year, which I think was a better reading. We made a mistake. We read Dalai Lama, and we read a different piece by John Paul II. And I want to give you a bit of flavor of what they have said, which will basically confirm what Benedict XVI, or the type of approach of Benedict XVI. The reason for Benedict XVI's text is that it's very recent. That's kind of the latest that has come out from a major leader of world communion on the question of globalization. But partly to give you a flavor also of more religions, because Buddhism this time around isn't as prominent as it was last year. Some other religions are. We're kind of migrating from one iteration of this course to the next in terms of religions. But partly also because it illustrates it so well, I'll invoke also Dalai Lama. By the way, the same issue was present, as I've recalled a number of times, the issue of the good, the human flourishing, the way of life, in our original session about bin Laden. Argument was it was not simply either irrational outbursts of hatred against something in the West, but rather that it is informed by a whole account of what it means to live well in the context of a religious interpretation of life. Account which many of us find problematic, but nonetheless, that's what it was. Let me now just mention, I have about 3.5 minutes, and I'll try to mention very quickly John Paul II and Dalai Lama, just quick summary of what they do. In the papers, which we can try to make available also for you. But generally, their engagement with globalization processes, and this is a direct address of that very issue, John Paul II, first affirmation is about the self. The self is human person, he says, is by nature endowed with universal, inviolable, and inalienable rights. Kind of human self as a bearer of rights. It's a universal claim, and it's also a faith claim. It's endowed by the Creator, obviously. Affirmation 2 he makes concerns social relations. And I'm picking out key central affirmations that he makes. Justice, he says, between people, of course, is rooted in love. Love ought to define, he argues, fundamentally relations between humans, not self-interest, right? Obviously, you ought to hear it as not simply self-interest, right? Also as a critical comment. Love defines fundamentally relations between humans. Justice as equality and respect for rights is an essential part of love. But love includes something more than justice, right? You had the same theme in the Benedict's text of Benedict that we read. And then comes injunction, which is kind of a moral imperative that flows out of this. You have to have globalization. Globalization is fine, but it has to be without marginalization of people, right? Human person must be the center of every social project. People should not engage in only seeking their own good. The weakest must be supported. And this applies to people everywhere and every time. And then finally, he comes to a motivation for the whole thing. Motivation is the vision of the good. In Benedict's text, it is this city of God, right? Or a little bit lower down, it's the common good, right? For John Paul II, it's God, the creator, who by definition is love. Why is it that human beings ought to love one another? Because at the very foundation of reality is the one who is love. That's the definition of the good. And all are called, therefore, to share in Christ's universal redemption. That is to say, give themselves to others as Christ has done himself. Quick rundown through Dalai Lama. I have -1 minute, is that right? Okay. Okay, I'll quick rundown through Dalai Lama. Affirmation 1, all desire happiness and seek to avoid suffering. That's, in a sense, that's almost like a definition of the good with which he operates. Affirmation 2, about the self, all have equal rights to pursue those goals. And affirmation 3 concerns the social relations. Altruism and compassion are the ultimate source of human happiness. And then affirmation 4, which simply follows from this, is altruism and compassion are the medicine for all human ills, key whether to equitable use of natural resources or resolution of conflicts. Now, I'm giving a very quick rundown down these things. I don't expect you to write those necessarily down. What I just want you to keep in mind is that you see what these two arguably of the greatest leaders, religious leaders of the second half of the 20th century have done. What they have done is basically they've taken the account of the good, of the self, of social relations, nature of reality, and they kind of brought it to bear on social relations, in this particular case, on globalization processes. That kind of fits together with Taylor's account that globalization processes refract themselves through culture understood as embodying explicitly or tacitly in accounts of self, social relations, and others. By the way, humanism also is a particular account of the self, of nature, of social relations, and also of the good, right? So it's not simply a religious prerogative to have those, but rather that can be non-religious accounts. Nonetheless, that seems to me to be a significant aspect of how faiths intersect with globalization processes. And with this, I think I will end and cede the floor to my friend, Professor Wright.